Hello students, today I plan to give you a very gentle introduction to brain-computer interface systems. Please watch the video lecture, which I have prepared, and in some slides the quality of the voice is not that good, but I hope you can still hear. After watching these lectures you can come back and join for Q&A sessions.
Outline of today's lecture is as follows. We'll try to answer the question, what is BCI, or brain-computer interface? We will see how it works, how and why it is difficult to build a brain-computer interface system. We'll summarize important topics, challenges of BCI research. Let's take a look at some of the Hollywood movies that highlight the BCI, brain-computer interface, in their science fiction. So humans have already fantasized to build some connection to the brain or to read human mind. Well, in these examples of these posters of the movie, we see that we have some kind of exoskeleton robot that is connected to the human brain, and then there is a direct control of these exoskeletons coming from the brain. So even here, for instance, in this movie, this movie really very interesting. I recommend you to watch, which highlights the science fiction and the idealized form of the brain-computer interface. Also, we can call these systems as a neural interface. We have some system implanted or connected to the human brain, and then the exoskeleton. And also, probably it's a little bit older movie, but also shows example of controlling human avatar from home remotely by just thinking. Another example, and the other example. Well, these Hollywood movies reflect the idealized form of brain-computer, also known as brain-machine interfaces, we can imagine. So there is a human, and with their brain, they're trying to control either computer applications or some external devices, such as exoskeleton, robot, or some remote-controlled avatars. Important question in BCI research is it even possible to build such systems? Can we hope to have these kind of systems in the future, or is it just being hyped? Let's take a look at different components of the idealized BCI, brain-computer interface systems, in those Hollywood movies. So what we have is, we have the brain, human brain, and we have some external computer applications, or the computer itself, some connection, control, and then the brain involves thought. And in those idealized science fiction BCI, they are very fast and then accurate. Fast in terms of translating human thought into control applications, so you can control exoskeleton very fast and with very high precision and accuracy. And also we can see one the other characteristics of science fiction BCI is as psychic, natural, intuitive thought directly turned into action. Right? So it's just like very, very natural and intuitive. You just think, and then your thought will be decoded into control signals, and then you can use those control signals to control those external applications. So we have feedback, some virtual reality, okay, maybe the movie Matrix, right? Also involves some kind of description of science fiction BCI. We also see physical connection to central nervous system. The central nervous system is entire brain, right? Plus some nervous connections. So they have physical connection. Well, another thing is that the better than natural or human. So that's the question. So all of these characteristics of science fiction BCI, brain-computer interface, is it better than natural human interaction? Is there a two-way communication? Is two-way communication possible between computers and the brain? So we can have two different settings here. The first is brain-computer interface versus computer-brain interface. So in brain-computer interface, what we have is we have human brain connected to external device, and the communication goes in one direction, from brain to outside device. So brain puts information into computer or some other device. So in CBI case, so computer brain interface case, we have external device. This can be a computer that is putting information into your brain, right? So there are two possible ways. So there are some brain disease disorders such as Parkinson's disease. They, for instance, use some so-called neurostimulation to stimulate certain parts of the brain, and we can think of this kind of stimulation as putting some information into the brain. Also, there are also some other brain disease conditions such as epilepsy. In practice, we can see CPI systems being used in clinical areas. So the aim is to stimulate certain parts of the brain to disrupt or to change the way the neural connections in the brain work. One of the early applications of computer to brain interfacing, it can be given in these examples. So for instance, we can use CBI to remotely control animals, or even there have been some attempts to get some to restore human vision using bionic eyes for blind people. And deep brain stimulation, as I briefly mentioned, is in practice nowadays for treatment of Parkinson's disease or even for depression. In one of the remote controlled animals example has been done by University of California, Berkeley, Professor Mahar B. So what they have tried to do is to control this beetle, okay, the green June beetle, by electrically stimulating the nerves, okay, or wing nerves of this beetle. So they could control the speed and then the direction of the flight of these green June beetles. And another example is so bionic eyes. So we have some digital camera, right, acquiring the images of surroundings, and then those images is being translated into some electrical pulses, right, that stimulate certain part of the um, area of the brain that is responsible for vision, so visual cortex, also so called. While these are early examples of CBI's computer brain interface, there has been a lot of recent advances as well. Nonetheless, our topic in this course is we focus on building brain computer interfaces, as in the following example. I'll show you a couple of demonstrations of a BCI or brain machine interface that has been developed by researchers. In the first example, we will see a paralyzed woman controlling a robotic arm with her mind using the most advanced brain machine interface ever developed. She can steer a robotic arm towards a bottle, pick it up, and drink her morning coffee. In the other example of brain machine interface system is shown here. This is again the earlier work that has been published in Nature Journal. So we see a person paralyzed, totally paralyzed. He has the implanted electrode and he can control the cursor using these thoughts. This is one of the very important application of brain-machine interfaces for paralyzed people. While we will study the differences of brain-machine interfaces, the one which you have seen corresponds to an invasive form of brain-machine interfaces. You can see here a tiny electrode that has been implanted on human brain cortex, as shown here. This is the result of the project called Brain Gate project. So we have a gate to the brain, and those tiny electrodes are controlled to the motor cortex of the human subject, and these are basically the signals coming out of the brain, and they are being translated in real time to control a computer cursor or external robotic arm. In this example, we see a brain-machine interface that is based on non-invasive approach. So, as you can see, a participant or this subject has electrodes, electrode caps picking up brain signals in a non-invasive manner from outside the brain, from the outside the scalp. Let's see. So what we have here is brain signals are being recorded in real time and being decoded into control commands. Basically, grasping. This also shows one of the important or essential application of brain-machine interface, brain-computer interfaces to support people who may have some amputated limbs. And you can see here the usefulness of this technology. So the brain-machine interface, along with robotic research, can help us to restore the motor function of the people who may have paralysis or who have lost their motor functions using some external prosthetic arms. Let's take a look at the other example of the non-invasive brain-machine interface that can be used to control a robotic device. The task is very similar to the one we have seen. Let me just pause here. So you can see different components. We have a human subject, which is me, and there is some cap, like swim cap, like put on a scalp with sensors attached. You can maybe you cannot see the sensors. And the task is to record, measure brain activities that correspond to mental intent of this participant and translate it into control commands. Those control commands can be move up, left, right, forward, backwards, and then we also have the gripper here. Maybe it just can be used to grasp the bottle. So let's quickly take a look how it looks like. So one of the things that I want to mention here that the non-invasive brain-machine interface systems or brain-computer interface systems are less accurate, much slower than the invasive brain-machine interfaces, as you can see here. However, they represent one of the safest interfaces we can develop to assist people who may need such technology. Okay, so let's take a look. And this is one of the very raw video, not professional, taken from one of our experiment by a student. So you can see a little bit shaking, shaky camera, shaking image. Yeah. All right, so it took around a few minutes to perform these tasks. So in reality, building the brain-computer interfaces can be challenging. You have seen a couple of video demonstrations, all look good and accurate. In particular, the so-called the brain gate project that we have seen can be used for controlling the cursor in two dimensions or the external robotic arm to reach grasp objects or some other application. We also have some portable technology, portable system that allows us to record brain signals in real time and then control, let's say, a computer application. This is a game. Or other applications such as grasping the bottle. We will see the BCIs or BMIs can be used also in virtual reality applications or for spelling. So for people who are unable to communicate, we can try to develop technology using BCIs. So now, if we compare the reality to the hype, or we can see that the control of the external devices using brain-computer interface is much less fine-grained. So it is not easy, as in those, let's say, science fiction movies, or even those demonstrative videos. And also, we need to emphasize that in reality, BCIs are restricted to only a small set of options, just a few commands, right? And also, they're very slow and inaccurate. One character, okay, much less. So, and also non-intuitive. So your thinking is not literally being translated into control signals, but you have to develop different thinking strategy so that you can control external robotic arm using your brain activity. And also we see that the signal that we record from the brain signals are corrupted by different sources of noise. As a result, we got some low signal to noise ratio, right? So the point here is again, in reality, the BCIs, building a brain-machine interface or brain-computer interface systems are challenging, requires a lot of engineering tasks, Also note, please, that I use BCI, BMI, or brain-computer interface, brain-machine interfaces interchangeably. Right? So there are some minor differences in the way they're formed, but they mean the same technology, same system. So I can switch brain-computer interface to brain-machine interface. Also, they are called sometimes neural interfaces. So what is BCI, or brain-computer interface, or brain-machine interface? So we have some common definitions that can be used. One of them is it's a system which allows someone to communicate information about their mental state without the use of peripheral nervous system. So there are two components that I want to emphasize. So we have mental state, we have someone, okay, and then peripheral nervous system. So without the use of peripheral nervous system is one of the important things. So the information, okay, should come directly from the brain. Right? This means, yeah, again, we need to record brain activities only to convert into control. So peripheral nervous system means no muscles, no eyes, no motor neurons, nothing outside the skull. How does a BCI work? So it is fundamentally a simple engineering problem. We can put different parts, components of the entire system in 4 different parts. So here, for instance, we can take a look at the entire flow. We have generation, okay, which involves getting the person to produce strong brain signal, either by performing an explicit mental task or through normal mental process. Right, so first is we need to get the data out of the brain or brain of the person or participant. So he should generate strong signals by thinking, right, a specific mental task. Second, since we have this data being generated by the person, we have the measurement part. So we need a system, some kind of technology, some sensors that will pick up the data or the signal or the brain signal from the human participant and then provides us quantifiable data of some form. So there are different technologies that we can use for measuring brain activities. fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, EEG, electroencephalography, or MEG, magnetic encephalography. There are some other imaging modalities that we can use to record brain activities, but these are just examples, 3 commonly used ones. And once we have the measurement, which provides us data, the next step is, next part of the BCI system is a decoding. So decoding involves building a classifier or decoder or machine that can decode the data that has been recorded, and that corresponds to mental state of the participant, right? To infer, again, mental state of the participant so that we can use it to output control signals, control or communications. In this case, communicate with, for instance, computer application. It could be translated as moving the cursor in XYZ directions, or to generate a control signal to move the robot arm in some given direction. And finally, we have the feedback. So the person generates a brain signal, okay, that corresponds to his or her mental state, mental intent. The device picks up that signal, quantifies, gives us discrete data. The set of machine algorithms, it's a computer algorithm, will decode that data and convert or translate it into control signal. And then person needs to see the result of his or her intent, either in a visual form or as a form of sound, auditory form. Basically, these are the 4 different components of the BCI.
Let's again talk about the generation details. So generation means get the person to produce a strong brain signal either by performing explicit mental task or through a normal mental process. We will see shortly that there are different experimental paradigms that are used to get the data or to get the strong signal from the brain. In the generation of the brain data, brain signals, there are some common mental tasks in practice. And we can divide those into experimental paradigms or experimental protocols called endogenous or exogenous. So endogenous depends on the experimental paradigm. That doesn't depend on external stimulation. So subjects can generate brain signals independent of external stimuli. We also call them as induced response. So it's internally induced response. For this class of experimental paradigm, there are some tasks such as imagination of the limb movement or motor imagery, which we'll see shortly. So another type of the experimental paradigm used for mental task-related brain signal generation is called exogenous. So in exogenous case, the difference is that this paradigm depends on the external stimuli, such as visual stimuli, auditory stimuli, or haptic stimuli. We also have defined this as evoked response. So the brain responds externally evoked, while here it is induced response. So let's take a look at one of the examples of endogenous experimental paradigm. So in endogenous, we said the subjects can generate brain signals independent of external stimuli, and they are considered as an induced response. One of the earlier examples of BCI, brain-machine interface or brain-computer interface, depended on so-called operant conditioning paradigm. So operant conditioning paradigm basically involves training the human to generate some specific patterns of the brain signal over some time. So those patterns are usually called slow cortical potentials. So they are slow waves coming from the brain or cortex. Potentials means the signals, and can be recorded at central scalp position. Right. So that means you can try to control, regulate one part of the brain to generate specific slow signals, so slow cortical potentials. And it requires, however, a quite lengthy process. It's just like learning a new skill, right? It may take some time, from 3 to 6 months, but eventually you will be able to control your brain to generate some specific patterns, and that can be picked up by an electrode. In this specific example, that the training is based on a similar paradigm called neurofeedback. You will sit in front of a computer. This is the monitor, and you'll have your EEG or some brain data acquisition system attached to your brain, to your scalp, non-invasively. And your task will be to control this ball up and down. So the yellow ball travels at a constant speed from left to right, and then your task is just to control up and down. You can do any kind of different, you can try different mental imagination techniques. For instance, you can imagine kicking some ball, squeezing something, any kind of imagination. Eventually, you'll be able to control this ball. This type of endogenous PCI can be used to control external applications, usually in a binary command. However, this is a very classical early version of the brain-machine, brain-computer interfaces that doesn't rely on any advanced, sophisticated signal processing or machine learning algorithms. However, it involves a human to train himself. Okay, training himself is equivalent to establishing some kind of neuronal network on your brain, or basically training your brain to generate some specific signal patterns or slow cortical potentials. Another example here I show is based on exogenous type of PCI, where human subjects are shown a grid of visual stimuli. And this stimuli is called Major Speller. Using this kind of exogenous PCI, we can develop PCI-based communication systems that allow people to type using their brain activities. Right? So this is called as brain-computer interface based on event-related potentials. Here, user concentrates on one of the symbols that is being flashed, usually in a pseudo-randomized order. So either rows or columns are intensified randomly. So you focus, pay attention, or you attend at some letter. For instance, you want to type N, right? You look at it, you pay attention to it, and then you can generate brain response locked to that event where this column and row is intensified. So that means, again, the target or column rows elicit or detectable event-related potentials. And the task of BCI is to detect these event-related potentials. So they look like this. So for instance, you're looking at N, and then the brain response will look as the following positive wave happening around 300 milliseconds. In contrast, the non-target brain response will be of lower amplitude. And we usually visualize brain activities using so-called topographic maps that shows us the amplitude, the strength of the amplitude of the signal picked up by specific electrode. Here electrodes are denoted by some crosses. This is the nose of the human, and the red represents the amplitude value, increase or decrease. So we can see that brain response can be picked up from the central locations of your scalp. If we take a look at specific time series that has been acquired by EEG system, we can see interesting patterns of the brain. So here we're looking from the top of the human scalp, nose, right ear, left ear, and we put sensors denoted by the following letters: FC, F4, CZ, and some others. And then if you visualize, right, brain response is picked up by these sensors in the form of time series, we see some interesting response. So, for instance, in this case, if our goal is to spell out the letter N, we pay attention to this grid N, while others are also being simulated. And that N will have, during that moment, will have brain response with higher amplitude. And this allows a classifier to detect the presence of human brain response versus the background brain activity. We will see the details of how to get this brain response and how to analyze, how to extract in the coming lectures. However, the point here is that I want to show you that the deflection of target and non-target brain waveforms in the raw form. Target response corresponds to the target stimuli we want to communicate, while non-target is any other letters being flashed, but you're not interested, you're not paying attention to those characters or stimuli. A potential application of such ERP-based BCIs is to assist people with severe neurological diseases that are leaving them totally paralyzed, even being unable to communicate. And there has been a lot of progress, actually. So this lady has been affected by so-called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So this is the degenerative disorder that eventually makes a subject or person totally locked in their body. So that means they can't even move any muscles. They can't even speak. They can't even, eventually at the late stage, they can't, unfortunately, move even their eyeballs. However, their brain is so healthy and intact, and they can hear surroundings, what's going on, but they can never speak it out or provide any kind of output for communication. And Niels Bierbaumer is a very famous professor from Germany, University of Tübingen, has been working in this area for decades, and he has developed a lot of applications applied on patients. So patients are able to use those PCI technology for communication. Right, this is one of his examples. So at our lab in Nazarbayev University, we have also developed a non-invasive version of this technology, BCI for communication, as you can see here. And the target and non-target event is based on his intention, what he wants to communicate right now. So the columns and the rows of the visual stimuli generate specific brain signals, and then further we classify them into target and non-targets. So he's now trying to spell out in Kazakh language Nauruz Qutlubosun. And this type of PCI is pretty accurate and possible to build with good accuracy. So these are the sensors, EEG sensors. We see here the amplifier and sample real-time brain data. So we are processing this data in real time, and then behind the scene, and then providing these decisions. And the role of signal processing and the machine learning is very, very important in this case. So we will see at some point later in the labs how to perform this kind of experiment. Alright, so we can see usually the accuracy is around 85% in our specific case, and then the time required for spelling one character usually lasts like for about 5 to 6 seconds. While it may look slow, but this intention, this character or spelling is coming directly from the brain, and then can be useful for people who are totally paralyzed or are suffering so-called totally locked-in syndrome problem. All right. So other example of the BCI is called Major BCI. Right now the task here is to move this robot into several directions. Why I'm showing this is that this paradigm is different from the previously shown one. Different because the subject, the participant, has nothing in front of him in terms of no LCD, no monitor. Right, so this is what makes it different, exogenous and endogenous. So he is now imagining of moving his left, right arms, and then also the foot movement. This is one of the graduation work done by our students a few years ago, and the entire framework is similar to what I have described. There's a bunch of sensors picking up the brain activity. In this case, we're recording data from sensory motor cortex, the brain area responsible for motor movement, like limb movement. Okay, and as you can see, it's quite slow, however doable. And also, let me show you another examples. This is what we have seen. It's called a P300 speller. Belongs to one form of exogenous BCI designed for communication. And here we have a very famous so-called Hexa Speller, which doesn't depend on external stimulation. While here, again, EEG cap, recording brain data. And then we have here some visual feedback. It's not stimulus. He is imagining a motor imagination task, moving his arms. From binary, we can map into multiple letter or character selection tasks. So both kind of systems have been developed and has been tested with real patients. We also have PCI systems that use steady-state visual evoked potentials, which belong to exogenous type of PCI. So here, the difference of this PCI based on SSVEP, so it's called SSVEP, is that we flash the characters or stimuli at some specific frequency, right? So for instance, so here we have 3x7 grid of stimuli, which can be replaced by characters. So each of these stimuli flash at different frequency. So it is different. It's not like column and row intensification. It is instead flashing at some frequency. So for instance, you can flash this one at 20 Hertz, 16 Hertz, 17 or 30, and some slower range. And then we can use a classifier to detect different patterns that has been generated by the brain, and that correlates with the flashing of some stimuli. For instance, if you look at the lamp or stimuli being flashed at 16 Hertz, and you can record data from the human brain. This is a picture of the brain simplified, and get some spectral information at that frequency band. This is amazing. And PCI based on steady state visual evoked potentials are one of the fastest PCI. Okay, and then SSVEP based PCI can use visual, auditory, or tactile. So you can stimulate your skin, muscles, and then try to get the corresponding brain data, and then design some kind of brain-computer interface applications. Next, we have sensor motor rhythm-based PCI systems. SMR stands for sensory motor rhythm. So the brain rhythm, the brain signal activity is coming from sensor motor cortex, which is located around this area. So SMRs belong to endogenous type of BCI. So basically, the subject imagines movement of right hand versus left hand. And by placing electrodes over sensor motor cortex around this area and recording the data, we can classify into two classes. So we can decode or discriminate left hand versus right hand, which allows us to build binary BCI systems. So anatomy of these imaginations and the data will be explained later, but the task is that now if you imagine, again, if you think or imagine of moving your limbs, left hand, right hand, versus also the foot movement, we can detect patterns in the brain data and then develop a kind of application. So simply here, after pre-processing, so raw data, we perform some specific bandpass filtering, and then we detect features. We also call them event-related desynchronization, ERD, or event-related synchronization. There are two phases. We will also see again all the processing pipeline of these data for building BCI in our experimental sessions. The motor major BCIs have been used in different applications. So that range from controlling a wheelchair or robotic arm, or as well as controlling exoskeleton robots for walking. In the early example, I showed this experimental setup, which we have developed in our lab. This is actually based on sensor motor rhythms PCI. So let me just show you again. So here subject thinks or imagines about moving his left, right arm, and then foot movement. Right? So and then he can generate three comments. So for instance, here we have the following settings. So plus means right hand movement imagination detected, minus means left hand movement imagination detected, and then this line or bar means foot movement. So by imagining foot, we can move up and down this bar, and then we can also design this kind of user interface for this kind of application, open and close also. Right? So we use foot movement to up, up, down, down, and then each time minus plus, which corresponds to left and right, for moving into left and then right directions. So finally, there is some another interesting application of endogenous BCI, which is based on redness potentials. So the redness potential represent the brain signal or brain response right before the onset of movement. Right. So for instance, in this example, we have sensors connected to the brain, and the task is to control this upper limb exoskeleton. And then the subject looks at this stimuli and intends to move this robot up and down. So he is not taking any visual stimuli. He's just using it as a feedback, visual feedback. So he imagines, he intends to move this robotic device, and then the brain already generates command. So if we capture those commands called redness potentials, we can use them to decode brain activities in real time. All right, so again, the redness potential location is different, but mainly they are present in the sensory motor and parietal cortex of the brain. All right, so just to summarize, there are different ways to generate brain signals. We have seen a couple of examples and demonstrations as well. We classified them into exogenous and then into endogenous type of paradigm or the process to generate. So exogenous depends on external stimuli, whether this is a flashing something to induce brain activities or to evoke, or exogenous or endogenous, which comes internally. So the BCI and the entire framework doesn't depend on external stimulation. So we have a subject, like in this case, not depending on any kind of external stimuli. Now, let's move into reviewing some measurement technologies, some measurement devices that allows us to acquire different types of brain signals, okay, such as EEG, MEG, fMRI. Then let's see. Type of the devices can be classified as invasive and non-invasive, or portable, non-portable, expensive versus cheap. So invasive usually involves implanting electrodes inside the skull, right, on top of the brain or deep inside the brain. So invasive basically involves opening up the skull and then putting the sensors again on top of the brain directly. So it requires surgery. So in one of the video demonstration I showed related to BrainGate projects, they implant these kind of sensors, or these kind of grid type of sensors. This is the opening of the brain skull. This is the tissue on top of the brain. These kind of experiments usually are done on patients who require some brain surgery, such as epileptic patients, or with the agreement of the patients who wants to try this new technology. And in contrast, we have non-invasive. These are the examples of the non-invasive technology. So one of them is called electroencephalography. In this case, we call them electrocardiography. So electrical system that records electrical activity of the brain from the cortex. All right, and we also have some single cell recording and some other details. So EEG is one of the widely used common portable modality that we use for developing BCI or BMI technology. And there is another portable one called near-infrared spectroscopy, so NIRS. So while EEG records brain activities that correspond to neuronal, let's say, firing at a low level, so synchronization, or that corresponds to electrical activity of the brain, NIRS, near-infrared spectroscopy, records blood oxygenation or hemoglobin concentration in the brain vessels. While we also have these systems you may have seen in the hospitals. These are very big, non-portable MEG. This is a magnetoencephalography. Example of this also records brain electric activity. Functional magnetic resonance imaging is another bulky system that allows us to measure brain activities with very, very good spatial resolution. Again, MEG records magnetic activities of the brain. In this course, we'll be mainly dealing with electroencephalographic data, EEG-based PCI, BMI systems. And sometimes we can also work directly with the data that represents the brain hemoglobin concentration levels. And also, we can also work on electrocardiographic signals. So if I open this slide, these are only some of the limited examples of brain imaging modality. We have some other technologies. And if you compare them, they have, in terms of scales, they have different characteristics. Like, we are interested in two things mainly: spatial and then temporal resolution. So the spatial resolution corresponds to how accurately or spatially, how precisely you can visualize or record brain activities. It's like the megapixel in your camera, how much higher megapixels you have, so the more better clarity you have or resolution. So time means how accurate or precise in time you can visualize, acquire the brain data. So we can see here, for instance, the comparison between different technologies. So EEG allows us to measure brain activities in the order of milliseconds, okay, 10 to the minus 3. MEG also same. ECOG, so implanted electrodes, very fast. Again, we can visualize brain activity in the order of milliseconds. While the spatial resolution of this EEG, MEG, and ECOG, well, is not that good. So we can see, we can represent each as a blurred image of the brain activity, but we have much information about the time. And we can also see there are some technologies called computed tomography. They provide relatively better temporal resolutions, while the spatial resolution is also good. So fMRI, for instance, yeah, it's good. in terms of spatial resolution, right? So we're talking about 4 millimeters here, 4 by 4, and some other MRI, for instance, is quite slow. This is, look, this is 1 second, 1 millisecond. Here, this PET MRI, they allow us to summarize brain activities around 1 minute. It's too slow. And SPECT is the slowest and with the bad spatial resolution. However, they can be used for other application, clinical application, not for BCI. For BCI, what we are interested in is how fast. Okay, how fast we can get the brain response decoded. So some of them are EEG, MEG, and of course we would like to pinpoint spatially, right, where in the brain is that fast activity is happening. So MEG is one good candidate. It has very good spatial resolution, some details you can see, and temporal and also non-invasive. However, it is bulky, non-portable. ECOG is very good candidate for developing BCI or BMI technology with a very fast, good temporal and spatial resolution. However, it requires brain surgery, which may be very costly. So here we have another schematic overview of the recording techniques that can be used for the purpose of building brain-machine interfaces. So here, this represents one single neuron, a bunch of neurons, and the brain activities. This is a gyrus, sulcus, a part of the brain, and MEG. So SUA stands for single unit activity, MUA stands for multi-unit activity. Single unit activity involves recording brain activities from single neurons in the brain. Right? The scale of these recorded neurons increases from left to right. Right? But this again happens at the expense of spatial resolution. Right? So here we have very good spatial resolution, temporal resolution. Invasiveness of a method is another important issue, especially if a BCI should be operational over a long period of time. On the left side, the nerve cells are actually attached or pierced with electrodes, which have been inserted right into the brain. So we open the scalp and then put a single, very tiny electrode. Well, while in two cases, right? While ECOG, look, this is a grid type of electrodes we call electrocardiography, can record a brain activity overall on top of the brain tissue, right, inside the skull. So we're not recording the single cell recording, which, okay, in this case also EEG finally records from the surface of the head, and it's not invasive at all. MEG as well. So you can see in this figure, one from single cell, from neuron, single neuron, and size of neuronal clusters, so brain cells, up to 100,000 neurons. So spatial resolution, here we have very high spatial resolution because we can pinpoint exactly which neurons are firing, where in the brain, and by analyzing the data. While in EEG case, so one sensor picks up the activities of 100,000 neurons. So spatial resolution is very poor because we cannot tell among which group of these 100,000 neurons are firing or working. And also we have invasive versus non-invasive. Safety or long-term durability is another important factor in developing BCI. You see? But recent research, especially Elon Musk, he's been working on developing his company called Neuralink, has been working on developing invasive BMI technology. We will see that later, the specific case. So in terms of the data set that is acquired in different forms, we can see here depth. Right? Depth corresponds to how deep we are inside the brain. LFP stands for local field potential. Recordings, which correspond to the recording of some electrical current from the activity of a group of brain cells, neurons, within the small region of the brain. While ECOG, electrocardiograph, represents recording over a large area of the surface of the cerebral cortex of the brain. Okay, and MEG, EEG, as I have already mentioned, these MEG, scalp EEG and MEG, recording of magnetic fields that are produced by electrical currents on these electrical currents from the surface of the scalp. And these signals come from hundreds of thousands of neurons and has to travel through the skull and several layers of the skin before being recorded or picked up by a single electrode. As a result, this several layer skull skin attenuates most useful information in EEG. In this animation, we see how we can relate the recorded brain EEG signals. These are a set of time series brain data acquired using electrocardiography. Can be represented or can be related to brain activation. Here you see the brain, flashing brain. Here one half of the brain, right side, one hemisphere, and left side of the brain. So we can see as these amplitudes and then visually frequencies gets increased, we see flashing, widespread flashing or increased activities in the brain. This data has been recorded from real epileptic patient. And then we see that the first phase corresponds to normal brain activity, and then brain starts to move into super excited, super activated mode, which corresponds to the epileptic attack that is encoded in these kind of synchronous time series data. And our task in brain-machine interface is to decode, right? To decode these kind of data, to translate them into external applications. Decoding mental state is the most important component of the entire PCI system, because given this kind of data set, we use signal processing or classification or decoding techniques in order to decipher brain activity or mental state. So building a machine able to decode measurements to deduce user's mental state is one of the crucial components that allows us to move into the final application, which is the controlling of different let's say output devices, computer cursor, and many others.